Next up, we visit the stadium hilariously designed to look like a toilet bowl, where we will be hosted by Tottenham Hotspur. Kick-off on Tuesday night is 8:15 p.m. Travel news is that the pile of laundry at the bottom of the stairs that caused so many delays en route to Wolves has been removed, but there may be an issue with the remote control. Viewers are advised to get to their seats early and check down the side of the sofa. Now here's an odd thing. Back in the day when football first started, not having existed before the commencement of the Premier League, all the talk was about the so-called Big Four, those being Arsenal, Chelsea, Liverpool and Man United. The arrival of all those blood-tainted petrodollars on the other side of Manchester then saw talk of the Big Five. However, this wasn't good enough for the size-obsessed average Tottenham fan, who insisted that there was such a thing called the Big Six. Sky were quite happy with that, partly to make it seem like the league was a little bit more competitive than it actually is, but mainly to stop the endless whining from Spurs fans about what a big club they are all the time. At the time of writing, the Big Six team sit in 8th place with 42 points from the 30 games played so far, which is level on points with Crystal Palace. So we can look out for some subtle marketing activity as the Big Ten starts to become a thing then. Their post-apocalypse return to action came on Friday night, where they held Manchester United to a 1-1 draw. Taking a lead against the run of play courtesy of De Gea's 22nd, most unusual for him, error of the season, they sat back for much of the rest of the game as a bang-average Salford 11 blundered about. In the end, it took a clumsy Dyer challenge to give the visitors a share of the points, though not before we were treated to the somewhat tiresome spectacle of Roy Keane going off on one in one of his increasingly predictable rants. These are largely from the Jeff Boycott, my gran could have played that with a stick of rhubarb school of rhetoric. Let's hope that Keane shares the same fate employment-wise. Tottenham received a boost with the return of Son Heung-min. The South Korea had returned home to recuperate from a broken arm when the COVID balloon went up. And since he was out there anyway, he booked himself in for a few weeks of national service with the South Korean Marines, thus ensuring that he wouldn't miss any game time through having to march up and down on the parade ground. The spell in uniform would have been longer, but members of the South Korean squad that had the usual 21-month service period reduced to mere weeks, thanks to a nation thankful for their 2018 Asian Cup success. Son is one of those not that type of players, insofar as he's capable of leaving his foot in or accidentally catching opponents with a flick of the hand on regular occasions. Harry Kane also returned to action in midweek, apparently. Daisy, the personal assistant with a beautiful smile, tells me that back in January they brought in a few faces. Gedson Fernandes was actually on our radar, but elected to head to Haringey because he liked the stadium. Presumably they whisked him there under cover of darkness. It's a little bit like buying a house with Chernobyl on one side and 3 Mile Island on the other, simply because the garden's got a nice bird table in it. Fernandes came in on an 18-month loan from Benfica. The transfer deal involving Giovanni Lo Celso was a bit of an oddity. The player arrived on loan from Real Betis last summer on a deal that included a number of complicated clauses. Spurs had an option to buy the player either in the January window for 27 million or in the summer window for 34 million. The option to buy in the summer also contained a clause making the purchase compulsory should, wait for it, Tottenham finish in the top 4. No, really it did. In the end, possibly prompted by their traditionally parsimonious chairman, they elected to take the cheap option and make the deal permanent early. The other permanent deal signed was that which brought Steven Bergwijn in from PSV Eindhoven. Bergwijn was the beneficiary of De Gea's 22nd, most unusual for him, error of the season the other night. Bergwijn, whose transfer came in at a shade under £27 million, was another who had the break to be thankful for. His damaged ankle ligaments back in March against Burnley seemed set to make him miss what was left of the season. 3 months of hand sanitizer worked wonders, and he made the starting 11 the other night. The principal departure in the window was that of Christian Eriksen, who left for Internazionale, the rationale being that he'd expressed his intention not to sign a new deal when his contract expired that summer. As is common in such situations, Inter came in with an offer suitably reduced to account for the fact that he could arrive for nothing a few months later. Eriksen gave everyone a good laugh when commenting on his departure by pointing out that he'd always wanted to play for a big club. A notable absentee the other night was Dele Alli, who was serving a one-match ban for posting a Snapchat video deemed to have been somewhat insensitive in these times of pandemic. Apparently, the offending message was deleted from what was a private group fairly quickly, and only came to light when what I presume is now an ex-friend sold it on to a tabloid. Given that other footballers have made far more heinous transgressions in the current climate, one almost felt sorry for Ali. Almost, but not quite. And now we move on to our look into the wacky world of association football. Since I last committed ink to paper, we've now had the restart of matches, which started with Aston Villa versus Sheffield United. I have, over the years, come in for a lot of stick for the hard time I give the Muppets at PGMOL. Well, the apologists are out in force again, happily blaming Hawkeye for confirming only that the ball had pitched outside leg stump or something, for the goal that wasn't. Nobody seemed to ask the most relevant question, which was why a referee and linesman, both PGMOL employees, required thousands of pounds of tech to establish what everybody else spotted clearly, and at once first time round, namely that the ball was a mile over the line. In my head I have a picture of Oliver watching a video of Ray Stewart or Julian Dix thunder a penalty into the back of the net, and Oliver shouting, "Oh, that was close," just because the Casio on his arm didn't start playing the Yellow Rose of Texas at the appropriate moment. And what on earth were the people doing at the VAR studio? You can imagine them sat there, or maybe at home, with their screens and a cup of takeaway Diego Costa coffee, missing the incident because they'd nipped into the kitchen to get a packet of Aldi own brand ginger nuts, before obviously invoicing the Premier League for the nuts coming from Fortnum's. Of course, once they realised, they were never going to intervene. Much better to palm the whole thing off on the IT guys for not turning it off and back on again properly, rather than ask the obvious question as to why it wasn't given without the use of robots. Elsewhere, matches have started, with players, staff and officials all taking the knee in support of anti-racism causes. John Terry was caught genuflecting like everyone else, but for some reason nobody thought to comment. Elsewhere, we've seen the introduction of crowd noise as a background to TV commentaries. I'm not too fussed either way myself, but the UHD channel used on the TV service of somewhat dubious provenance here at the Avram Grant Olympic Rest Home for the Bewildered doesn't actually give you the opportunity to switch the damn thing off. On the whole, it's worked quite well, with the sound editors doing a decent job of getting the sound selection to match the action. There have been odd moments, though, where it hasn't sounded right. For example, when a shot hits the side netting, whilst they have the curtailed cheer that always happens when supporters realise it's hit the net from the wrong side, that doesn't sound right without the usual accompanying sneer of derision from the opposition fans. I'd settle for that with or without the usual rendition of "sit down, shut up." It does sometimes sound like the crowd haven't got a clue what's going on. Bit like Sellers Park in that respect. When Arsenal keeper Leno picked up that nasty injury, for example, you'd have thought a cracking end-to-end battle was occurring while they got the poor bloke onto the stretcher. Clearly they need a muted and concerned hum button. Okay, here we go. Let's move on to us. Well, all the pre-match talk was of fresh starts, determination and opportunities. Well, if that was a determined performance, I'd hate to see one where the players weren't bothered. That had all the hallmarks of the worst of the Allardyce era, where a team appeared to be set up to avoid defeat rather than to get a win. The team lacked pace, fitness, creativity, nous, tenacity, just about anything you'd normally need to win a football match. I claim no deep tactical insight, but if I can point out in this column that Traore might just cause problems, if allowed to do so, surely it ought to occur to someone on the coaching staff. Now, to be fair, it might be argued that the team tactics were limited by the number of and quality of players available for selection. Haller's groin may have been an unexpected problem, but it served to highlight both the specific issue, namely the paucity of striking options at the club, and the more fundamental issue of a transfer policy that seems predicated on signing square-peg players and hoping that they'll fit into round holes. Haller is a case in point. His record shows that he's a decent striker when his strengths are played to. This usually means him having a strike partner located somewhere in the same postcode district as him. What he's not good at is playing as a lone striker. He tries, bless him, but it's not his game. Adjeti is clearly impressed in training about as much as he has during his rare appearances. Antonio is pretty much the only option alongside Haller, and as we saw on Saturday, if Haller's not available, he ends up just as isolated. The general transfer policy seems at the moment to come directly from the owners. There are, of course, legendary tales of players turning up without the manager's input. It's almost as if every agent in Europe, and a few in South America, has the name Sullivan on speed dial, as they try and unload any old rubbish to us in an effort to claim 10% of a player's inflated Premier League salary. The recent experience of having a director of football may have soured the concept in the minds of the owners. Certainly putting any faith in somebody who thought Roberto was a good idea, in spite of all the evidence to the contrary, would make anyone think twice. However, the fact that Husios, for whatever reason, turned out to be a lousy director of football shouldn't rule out our having one in the future. Sadly, one can almost hear the obdurate tones of Mr. Sullivan saying, "Didn't work any better than when I was doing it myself." If that's his view, it would be unfortunate. Two wrongs don't make a right, and you only have to look at Wolves to see what benefits can be gained from a club where everyone is pulling in the same direction. A proper director of football would set things on an even keel going forward. However, we do need to address the immediate future. We have depressingly had to rely on the likes of Palace and Chelsea to keep us above the trapdoor this weekend, and this weekend's display needs to be treated as a warning. The team news is that the injury list has gone from the one we had last week to 5. Ogbona's knee has turned out to have been a hamstring, and Haller's groin was troublesome enough for him to miss Saturday. To those we can add Snodgrass, who's got a bad back and ankle, Zabaleta, who appears to be waiting for a new bus pass, and Masuaku, who has some sort of unspecified knock. Some sources give Snodgrass a small chance of being available, with Ogbonna being the more likely appearance. Haller's groin is still a bit sore and he hasn't trained at the time of writing. Now, normally I fancy us to do well at their place. However, as we've seen, the weirdness of the behind-closed-doors resumption has proven to be a great leveller. They did get a draw against the Salford lot. After all, even if that did have more to do with how poor the opposition was that night. Much will depend on us learning lessons from the debacle against Wolves and possibly on the manager being bold-minded enough to make a few changes. Past experience, however, suggests that we simply won't learn. So my usual optimism's out the window, and I can see us losing this one, which will just show how far we've plummeted in recent months. I'm going to stick the £2.50 that I would have gone on a copy of 101 Things to Do in Haringey to Centre Fernandez. I'm going to put it on a 2-0 home win. That's all from me. Remember, the full version of this, for those of you who can read without moving your lips, is available on kumb.com, including details of the referee and, of course, the famous Percy's poser. Enjoy the game.